We pulling?
Hey, I'm Zax, and here's all of our guides for normal and heroic Nerub-ar Palace, for the people that would rather see them all in one video. And this video is brought to you by TSM, the sick auction house add-on you've probably already heard of, and their crazy new auction house database, which we'll tell you more about in a little bit. Also, big thank you to our supporters on Patreon. We hope you'll enjoy all the Patreon exclusive content we've got coming out this tier, like extended heroic guides, mythic guides, and more. Alright, so Ulgrax is this big angry lobster. He has two alternating phases with a bunch of AoE in phase 2, and you want to bloodlust on pull. Phase 1 is pretty straightforward. When the boss casts Brutal Crush, it does big physical damage and leaves a huge healing reduction on the target, so the tanks need to taunt swap right after every cast. When the boss puts these swirlies on the ground everywhere, dodge them and then stay out of the webs they leave behind because they damage and root you. And when these green circles go around a few players, they need to spread out from each other and stand beside a bunch of the webs on the ground, because the circles remove any webs that they're touching when they expire. Ideally, you clear sort of a runway behind the boss for the big mechanic of the phase that happens right after, which is this big swirly on a random player. The swirly does split damage, and then the boss pulls everyone in it toward him, one-shotting anyone that gets too close to him. And the strength of the pull gets reduced for each person you add to the swirly. So everyone needs to help soak it while the targeted player moves a little bit away from the boss, and then everyone has to run away until the pulling is over. Warlock gateways can be real nice for this. When the boss runs out of energy, he does a big jump to the middle of the room that knocks everyone back. So try to avoid getting knocked off the platform or into any leftover webs. And then the boss disappears and starts phase 2. This phase is a little weirder. You have to dodge these charges the boss is doing across the room, which you can see coming based on these swirly orb things flying through the air. And while you're dodging those, you also have to tank and kill a bunch of these little ads that spawn around the room. They don't do much, but they do put a bleed on the tank that stacks up. So tanks might need to keep an eye on that and maybe get a bleed dispel like Cauterizing Flame from an evoker. When the little ads die, they drop these little food nuggets on the ground, which everyone needs to pick up, and then take over to the boss when he comes back, and then press their extra action button to feed the boss and give him energy, because he's immune to damage in this phase, and getting him to full energy makes him start phase 1 again, not immune. The boss also casts more and more raid-wide damage the longer he's in phase 2, so that's even more reason to feed him quickly. But once you're back to phase 1, it's rinse and repeat, and that's pretty much it. Alright, so the Bloodbound Horror is this big red Kool-Aid monster. He only has one phase. It's mostly single target, but there's a small number of ads to cleave sometimes. And you'll want to bloodlust on pull. But before you pull, you need to split your raid into 2 halves, with a tank and healers in each half, and assign them as group 1 and group 2 to be able to deal with the main mechanic of the boss, which is, every once in a while, the boss spawns ads in a different realm that you can't attack in the normal realm, and you need people to go into that other realm and kill them, or else you're dead. So here's what you need to do. The 2 raid groups should start the fight separate from each other, and the group 1 tank should start with the boss. When you see where these purple swirly things spawn around the room, showing where the ads are going to spawn, all of group 1 should move with their tank toward those swirlies. And then when the boss starts casting this big frontal on the tank, all of group 1 should make sure to get hit by it, because it sends everyone it hits to the other realm for a while. Then the group 2 tank taunts the boss, and group 1 nukes down all the ads before their time is up and they get sent back to the normal realm automatically. There's always a big ad that has to be tanked and interrupted, or else the boss gets a huge shield. And there's up to 2 or 3 caster ads, which all they do is spawn little ads over and over that walk toward the boss and blow up on the raid if they reach it. So everyone should use slows and stuns and knockbacks and all that on the little guys while cleaving everything down on the casters. The casters can spawn split up from each other, so you may need a player or 2 to go CC or kill the little ads that are far away until the rest of the group cleans up and makes their way over. After group 1 comes back, the same thing happens for group 2. The ad swirlies show up, group 2 moves together and gets hit by the frontal, and they clean up all the ads. Then group 1 again and repeat. And the reason you have to alternate groups each time is because the frontal gives you a big damage taken increase to the following frontal. On heroic, shortly after every frontal, the boss spawns these beams out of his sides that rotate slowly around the room for a while, one-shotting anyone they touch. They always rotate to the right looking at the boss, and they're pretty easy to avoid, but the main issue with them is that they can cut the ad group off from being able to reach their ads to kill them in time. Fortunately, because the beams always spawn out of his sides, the tank with the boss can always control where they spawn. So for example, let's say the ads are spawning here. Facing the boss this way and spawning the beams like this is bad, because it's going to quickly go through the ads and cut everyone off. So instead, you face the boss like this, so the beam is already past the ads and there's plenty of time before the other beam comes all the way around. This positioning is going to take some getting used to, but it's pretty vital to kill the boss on heroic. All of that is the main challenge of the fight, but there are some other mechanics to deal with. There's some swirlies to dodge that follow random players for a few seconds. Try not to sprint around and move in random directions so they're easier for everyone to dodge. The boss puts a heal absorb on the entire raid every once in a while, which the healers have to deal with, of course. And at full energy, the boss casts this huge circle around himself that everyone has to run out of. Just try to avoid being in the pools on the ground for too long because they do a big damn. And that's pretty much it. Alright, so Sikran is this blue General Grievous looking dude. He only has one phase, it's entirely single target, and you'll want to Bloodlust on pull. There are two main things you need to do in this fight. The first thing is when a few players get this red mark over their head, they need to move together toward the edge of the room and spread out a little bit from each other, because the boss casts a charge that goes through each marked person and spawns one of these shadow images where it hits each player. And the second thing is when a few players get this blue mark over their head, they need to move between the boss and some of the shadow images while staying a little spread out, because the boss casts a beam in each of their directions that destroys any of the shadow images it hits. You want the charge targets to be in the same general area because the charge puts a big dot on anyone it goes through, so you want to make it easier for everyone else to dodge it. And destroying the images leaves a bad pool on the ground for a while, so keeping them close together makes it so you don't fill the entire room up real fast. The raid will just have to rotate around the room a little bit every time the pools spawn. The images also put a stack of a short dot on the whole raid when they're destroyed, so you want to stagger destroying them as you go through the fight, because otherwise the boss destroys all the remaining images when it gets to full energy, and that does way too much damage. On Heroic, the charge from the boss also spawns a shadow image for any extra person it hits along the way, so it's even more important for everyone to dodge it. And the pools on the ground last forever, so it's more important to spawn the images in good spots. If you get the two main mechanics right, the charges and beams, there's actually not much else going on in the fight. His full energy cast does big damage to the raid that's decreased the further away you are from him, and if you're too close, he knocks you back and makes you take way more damage for a while. So everyone just has to move a bit away from him for that. There are some swirlies on the ground sometimes for everyone to dodge. And finally, the tanks have a taunt swap mechanic to deal with. The boss does a 3-cast combo, where he casts Expose twice in a row and then casts Phase Lunge. Expose does big physical damage and leaves a physical damage taken increase on the tank, and Phase Lunge does big mixed damage and leaves a damage taken debuff to the following Phase Lunge. So all the tanks have to do is use a defensive cooldown and taunt swap after the second Expose cast. And that's pretty much it. Alright, so Rasha'nan is this big ugly mosquito. She only has one phase. It's mostly single target with a little bit of AoE pad every once in a while, and you'll want to Bloodlust on pull. The boss actually starts out at 60% health because of some RP in a dungeon, and there's not really a main mechanic in this fight, just a bunch of simpler mechanics that all happen back to back real fast. So here they are. If you get this gray circle around you, run away from the raid and spread out from other circled people because the circle explodes after a couple seconds and leaves webs on the ground. And then run out of the web you spawned to break the tether that the web is pulling you in with. Breaking the tether does some raid-wide damage, and on Heroic, anyone that gets hit by those gray circles gets tethered, so it's even more important for everyone to avoid them. If you get this green line on you, run away from the raid in the direction that the line has this green stuff flowing out of it, because the line spawns these green waves out of it that move in that direction. The waves put a huge dot on anyone they touch, and they turn any webs they touch into acid pools, so getting them to go away from the raid is a big deal. If you get this yellow mark on your head, run toward the front of the boss and group together with the other marked people, because a bunch of little ads spawn on the marked players which need to be AoE down. They cast a little dot on random players, so AoE stuns can be good to prevent those from going out. And on Heroic, the marked players do a little explosion in this green circle around them when the ads spawn, so they have to try to avoid being in each other's circles when they're grouping together in front of the boss. The tanks have a taunt swap mechanic to deal with. When the boss casts Savage Assault, it does big mixed damage to the tank and leaves a huge dot on them that is increased by how much damage the initial cast did. So the tank with the boss has to use a big defensive, and then the other tank has a taunt right after. At full energy, the boss flies away to a random spot in the room and everyone has to follow her while dodging a bunch of swirlies that leave acid on the ground, and then interrupt her acidic eruption cast to prevent her from going immune and doing a bunch of raid-wide damage, which then gets her to start using her regular abilities again. On Heroic, the boss also has a new ability that spawns this swirly circle on the ground, which everyone has to go help soak, because it does big split damage and then pulls everyone in it toward the edge of the platform. The strength of the pull is reduced for each person in the circle, so everyone needs to be in there or else you go flying off the platform. And that's pretty much it. Now, before we get to the next boss, quick sponsor time. TSM is a sick add-on you've probably already heard of, but now it has a bunch of crazy new features they've added to elevate your gold making game. It makes managing your auctions super easy so you never undersell or overpay, and for crafters, TSM takes your professions to the next level by showing you what's most profitable to craft. With their new premium packages, you get access to TSM's huge auction house database, helping you figure out what to buy and when to sell for maximum profit. If you want to stop being broke, use the link in the description to grab 15% off your first premium package and start making more gold with way less effort. Alright, so Broodtwister is this big ugly slug. She only has one phase, there's a ton of cleave and AoE in the fight, and you'll want to bloodlust on pull. The first thing to note with this boss is that there are all these eggs in her room, in 3 different sections that each have one of these big containers in them. Shortly after pulling, and every time the boss gets to full energy, the boss runs over to the closest container to her and breaks it open, spawning this pool on the ground that slowly grows over time. And the goal of the fight is to break all the eggs around that container before the pool reaches them and explodes them, putting a huge dot on the raid. The only way to break the eggs is with these little purple circles that sometimes go on random players, which break any eggs within the circles when they expire. So everyone has to be ready to break an egg if they get the purple circle, and you should prioritize breaking eggs closer to the container first because the pool gets to them pretty quick. Breaking an egg also spawns one of 3 adds based on what kind of egg it is. The big round eggs spawn a spider that needs to be tanked because it has a big magic damage cast that also gives them a stack of a damage increase. The skinnier eggs spawn a caster worm that has to be interrupted every once in a while to prevent some raid-wide damage. And the little egg clusters spawn a bunch of parasites that have to be CC'd and killed from range before they reach their fixate target, put a huge dot on them, and then duplicate themselves. These things are super similar to the parasites from Magma in Cataclysm. Each of the 3 sections in the room has more of one kind of egg than the others. So this one has more big eggs, this one more skinny eggs, and this one more egg clusters. It doesn't really matter which order you do the sections in, but we recommend starting in the big egg section because the tank spiders are easier to deal with, and then go to the skinny egg section and then the egg cluster section last because dealing with 2 packs of parasites at once can get a little sketchy. Everyone's going to need to help with CCs and knocks and slows and all that in this last section especially. For heroic, here's a little map we cooked up for the order we recommend breaking the eggs in. There's a bunch of different ways to go about it, but this worked great for us in testing. We'll put a link to this picture in the description if you want it. All of that is the main challenge of the fight, but there are a couple other mechanics to mention. The tanks have a taunt swap mechanic to deal with. When the boss casts Volatile Concoction, it does magic damage to the tank and puts a big dot on them for a few seconds. And then when the dot expires, it explodes on the raid, doing more damage the lower the tank was when the dot expired. So the tanks need a taunt swap after this cast, the tank with the dot needs to use a defensive that lasts through the end of the dot, and the healers need to blast the tank with heals to make sure they aren't low when the dot expires. There's also these waves of swirlies on the ground for everyone to dodge throughout the fight, and on heroic, when random players get a permanent dot debuff that puts a gray circle around them, they need to spread out away from other players and then get dispelled, because the debuff explodes on anyone in that circle when it's dispelled, also rooting them for a while. And that's pretty much it. Alright, so Ky'veza is this purple Assassin's Creed looking lady. She has 2 alternating phases, which are entirely single target, and you'll want to bloodlust on pull. Phase 1 is mainly about all these rifts that spawn and try to suck everybody into them, one-shotting anyone that touches them. And the goal of the phase is to spawn the rifts sort of opposite from each other around the room, so each of their sucks kind of cancels each other out and everybody ends up safe in the middle of the room. So here's how you do that. Tank the boss toward one of the corners of the big hexagon pattern on the ground and keep her there the whole phase. And when random players get these purple circles around them, they need to spread out around the outside of the room, ideally standing on different corners of the hexagon to make things easy to see. After a couple seconds, the circles spawn these shadow images that just kind of stand around, but they are where the rifts come from. When the boss casts Nether Rift shortly afterward, she spawns a rift on herself as well as every shadow image, and then they all suck for a few seconds. If you spread the images out decently enough, you won't even have to run against the suck because they cancel each other out, but definitely do run if you're a little too close to a rift. Shortly after that, each shadow image starts casting a charge toward a random player, which you can see based on these blue beams, and the only way to tell if you're targeted by one is by looking to see if one of the beams is red. If one of them is red, that image is about to charge through you. So you need to run over close to it and ideally face the charge toward the outside of the room. This makes it so the charge is easy for everyone else to dodge and makes it so the images don't end up clumped together, which would make the following sucky rifts a little more difficult to deal with. If your image is already super far away, it's fine to aim it toward the middle, just make sure the charge is short and it'll be alright. After that, you get more rifts to deal with, and the rest of the phase just alternates between the rift spawning and the adds charging. But there are some other mechanics to deal with in the phase. There are these blue lines on the the ground for everyone to dodge, which come from the boss and all the images. The boss actually tries to execute anyone who gets below 10% health, so healers have to be extra on point in this fight. The tanks have a taunt swap mechanic to deal with. When the boss casts Void Shredders, it does huge mixed damage to the tank and leaves a dot on them that makes them take more damage from the following Void Shredders. So the tank with the boss just has to use a big defensive cooldown, and then the other tank taunts right after the cast. And on Heroic, anyone that gets hit by the purple circles that spawn the shadow images, or gets hit by the charge from the images, gets a short dot that explodes on them when it expires, also sending out projectiles on the ground for everyone to dodge. So anyone with the dot needs to spread out away from everyone before it expires. Eventually, when the boss reaches full energy, she stops all those mechanics and starts phase 2, where she goes to the middle of the room and starts a long channel that pulses raid-wide damage. These blue lines constantly go on random players, which do damage to anyone in the line after a couple seconds. So everyone has to avoid being in each other's lines and try not to move the lines around too much. And on Heroic, these blue cones spawn on the ground and explode after a couple seconds, so everyone has to avoid being in those. They actually rotate around in a predictable way, so if you kind of stay in one area, you shouldn't have to move very much the whole phase. At the end of the channel, the boss starts phase 1 over again, and it's rinse and repeat. Just make sure to do enough damage to kill the boss before the third phase 2, because then she enrages and that phase gets real nasty. And that's pretty much it. Alright, so the Silken Court is Dumb and Dumber over here. We'll call the skinny one the caster boss and this other guy the melee boss. They have 3 phases with a couple intermissions in between them. You fight both bosses at the same time, so it's mostly a 2-target cleave fight, and you'll want a Bloodlust on pull. But before you pull, you need to assign 2 players to be in charge of the tether mechanic of the fight, and you should put a mark on them so they're easy to see. Ideally, they are mobile range DPS or healers, and on Heroic, you actually need to assign 2 pairs of 2 players for this, so 4 total. This assignment is for the most important mechanic in phase 1, and here's what they need to do. When a bunch of these swirlies spawn on the ground, everyone needs to dodge them and then stay out of the webs they leave on the ground. And then the assigned players need to move together next to one of the webs and wait. Then when the melee boss gets to around 90 energy, they both need to move into the web, and one of them needs to move into the little bubble in the middle of the web to explode it, which creates a tether between the 2 players. Then they need to stay close enough to each other to not break the tether, shown by this big circle around them. And finally, when the melee boss gets to full energy and starts casting this charge across the room, one of the players needs to move to the other side of the charge to stretch the tether across the charge path. So when the boss charges, the tether stops him and prevents him from hitting the wall, which would do an insane amount of raid-wide damage and probably cause a wipe. As a little bonus, the boss takes double damage for a few seconds if you stop the charge, but you have to do all this twice in the phase before it's over, and on Heroic, you need the charge to go through 2 different tethers to stop it, which is why you need 2 pairs of 2 players to handle all that. It's definitely a little complicated, but if you can manage the charge, everything else in the phase is a lot simpler. The bosses share health, so it doesn't matter which one you hit, and the tanks should try to keep them stacked as much as possible for cleave damage. But the caster boss can't be moved and he jumps around randomly, so they can't be stacked 100% of the time. The tanks also have to taunt swap on the melee boss after every time he casts Piercing Strike, because it does a ton of physical damage and increases damage taken from the following Piercing Strike. And the tank that has aggro on the caster boss has to be dispelled pretty often because she spam casts Poison Bolt on them, which does magic damage and applies a heavy dot. When everyone gets this green circle around them, you need to spread out so you're not in each other's circles before they explode after a couple seconds. When the melee boss spawns these adds, they fixate random players and melee them, giving them stacks of a damage taken increase. So the fixated players need to try to drag the adds through the melee boss so they can get slowed and cleaved down by everyone. On Heroic, the adds have a big damage reduction buff that goes away over time, so they just take a little longer to kill. And when the melee boss casts this big cone on the ground, everyone needs to quickly move out of it before the cast finishes, and it impales anyone it hits, doing a ton of damage to the player and stunning them until the impaling spike is destroyed by other people. Once the caster boss gets to full energy after a couple minutes, the first intermission starts, where the melee boss hides and the caster boss goes to the middle of the room, gets a big shield, and starts a long channel. This channel does ramping raid-wide damage and spawns these cones all around the boss, which everyone has to avoid being in when they explode after a few seconds. The timing of the cones can be a little tricky because the whole room fills up before they start exploding, but just stand in a newer cone until an older one explodes and then move into the safe spot it leaves behind. Once the boss's shield is broken, phase 2 starts, where the melee boss comes back and both bosses get some new abilities. The only thing that changes for the melee boss is that he doesn't do the charge in this phase, but now instead he has the new main mechanic of the phase. At some point he puts a dispellable debuff, Stinging Swarm, on 3 random players, and when this debuff gets dispelled, it jumps to the closest player or the caster boss if she's the closest. And the goal with these debuffs is to get them all onto the caster. Importantly, getting the 3rd stack of the debuff onto her when she gets to full energy energy and starts her big raid wiping cast, Cataclysmic Entropy. When she gets the 3rd stack, it interrupts the cast, preventing the wipe. The way we recommend making this happen is by having the 3 players with the debuff, which you can see based on this swirly purple effect around them, go stand in a triangle around the caster boss while everyone else gets away from them. And then when the big cast starts, quickly dispel all 3 of them and GG. You could even use mass dispel from a priest to make it real easy. Each dispel also does some raid-wide damage, so the healers will need to get everyone topped beforehand. So that's the new main mechanic. As for the caster boss, her abilities are all new but simple. The cast she spams at the tank is now Void Bolt, but it does the same thing, just needs a dispel sometimes. She has a random cone on the ground for everyone to dodge before it explodes. And she casts a raid-wide pull-in that also tethers random players together, followed immediately by a big explosion in a circle around her that everyone has to quickly run out of. You don't actually need the tethers for anything in this phase, so just make sure to run away from your partners and break the tethers to remove the dot it puts on you. Once the melee boss gets to full energy after another couple minutes, the second intermission starts where the caster boss hides and the melee boss goes to the middle, gets a big shield, and starts a long channel. Very similar to the first intermission. But now instead of cones on the ground, a bunch of these rings spawn around the room that everyone has to avoid being in when they explode, or else they take a bunch of damage and get impaled and have to be broken out. Once the boss's shield is broken, phase 3 starts, where the caster boss comes back and things get real. This phase has both of the main mechanics from phase 1 and 2. So the melee boss does the charge again, and he puts out those debuffs that you have to transfer to the caster boss at the right time. And to make things even more complicated, the only way to get tethers for the charge is from the raid-wide pull-in the caster boss does, which just tethers random people together, so you can't really just rely on the assigned people from phase 1 to handle it. There will probably be some add-on or weak aura thing that tells you who should keep their tether, but otherwise, we recommend all the ranged and healers keep their tethers and use them for the charge, unless the raid leader calls for specific people to keep their tether and then everyone else can break them to prevent some dot damage. And don't forget, 2 tethers are needed on Heroic. As for the other mechanics of phase 3, the melee boss doesn't spawn ads anymore and he doesn't have a frontal. Instead, he spawns rings on the ground for everyone to dodge, like in the second intermission, and he has a big raid-wide damage channel for the healers to watch out for. And that's pretty much it.
Hey, I'm Jim Pro. I guess it's my turn. So Queen Ansurek is the big booty spider lady over here. She has 3 phases with an intermission after phase 1. There's a lot of cleave and AoE damage to do in the fight, and you'll want a Bloodlust on pull. But before you pull, you need to set up some key assignments. First of all, split the raid in half with a tank and healers in each half, and make sure everyone knows if they're in group 1 or group 2, because the raid has to split up in phase 2 later on. Put a world marker here in the north and here in the south, and assign group 1 to the north one and group 2 to the south one. Then assign your most trusted ranged DPS to be the popper of the bombs in phase 1, which I'll explain in a second. On Heroic, you have to assign 3 pairs of 2 players to be the bomb poppers, so 6 in total, and make sure that players in each pair are in different halves of the raid. And also on Heroic, assign an order for the healers in either half of the raid to dispel a certain debuff in phase 2. I know it's a lot of assigning, but you can't really beat the boss without it. On to phase 1. Pull the boss out of the middle of the room, and when she casts Liquefy on the tank, a few things need to happen all at once. The first tank uses a defensive cooldown for Liquefy, the second tank should taunt immediately after and use a defensive cooldown for the follow-up cast Feast. Healers need to quickly spam heals on the second tank to remove the heal absorb from Feast because they'll still be tanking the boss. Meanwhile, the raid dodges swirlies and the tank moves the boss away from the puddles. Now that's the first combo done. When the boss casts Reactive Toxin and puts this green circle on a random player, they need to move between the boss and the old pools on the ground until the circle expires after a couple seconds and drops a bomb on the ground. Then the boss starts casting Venom Nova, and the bomb on the ground gets a circle around itself, which everyone needs to quickly move into without actually touching the bomb that's in the middle of the circle. And when the Venom Nova cast finishes, your assigned bomb popper needs to step onto the bomb, which detonates it, sending everyone in the circle up into the air and over the big green ring that expands out from the boss, or else, you guessed it, you're dead. On Heroic, there's 2 of these bombs, and you have to split your raid evenly between both of them because each bomb splits stack of a debuff between anyone that gets hit. And if you don't split it enough, it does crazy damage at the end of it. So you can just use the raid split that you assigned for phase 2. Group 1 gets in the bomb closer to the edge of the room, and Group 2 gets in the bomb closer to the center of the room. And by the way, you need different poppers each time on Heroic because the bomb gives you a debuff that makes you get 1 shot from the next bomb you touch. So make sure to assign that as well. After you land, the popper has to get away from the raid with his this big circle on them, and everyone has to dodge the waves that come out from where the bomb exploded. And that was the second mechanic combo. When the boss starts casting Silken Tomb and puts these little circles around everyone, you all need to group up together close to the boss without being in each other's circles, because at the end of the cast, everyone explodes in their circle, gets rooted, and spawns an ad that breaks your root when it dies. So everyone has to help AoE down all the ads to get everyone out of the roots quickly. And a little tip is that anything that removes the roots also still works, like Disengage or Hand of Freedom, so you don't need to group up if you have something like that. And on Heroic, the root leaves a nasty web on the ground when it's destroyed, so if you're gonna free yourself, it's best to do it away from the boss and ideally towards one of the old pools on the ground. Everyone else just has to get out of the webs as fast as possible once they're broken out. And that's the third mechanic done. And finally, everyone has to dodge all these random lines on the ground. Shortly after the third Venom Nova, or if you've already gotten the boss to 35%, she starts the intermission where she jumps to the middle of the room, gets a big absorb shield, and attaches these web lines to everyone that slowly pull you toward her. And if you get close to her, you're dead. She also occasionally casts Rest, which yanks everyone toward her, so you want to be far away from her by the end of that cast. And she casts Paralyzing Venom, which sends out these big globs and waves that everyone has to dodge. And the cast also puts a stack of a slow on everyone, so it gets harder and harder to stay away from the boss the longer the intermission goes on. On Heroic, everyone also has these little circles around them that pulse damage to other players, so try to stay a little spread out. Once her shield is broken, she starts phase 2, where she goes immune and spawns a couple Void Speaker ads on opposite sides of the platform. This is where the two halves of the raid need to split up, group 1 to the north ad and group 2 to the south ad, and kill the ads while interrupting their Shadow Blast cast. And on Heroic, you also have to dodge this little swirly and the orbs that get launched out of it. A couple of seconds after the ads die, they do a big knockback from where they died, which everyone needs to use to get knocked up to the side platform and start killing some new ads. The tanks have to get aggro on the Chamber Guardians and face them in a way that their Oust cast doesn't knock them off the platform. Everyone has to dodge this line on the ground from the Chamber Expellers, which damages and knocks back anyone it hits, and everyone has to avoid being pulled off the platform by the boss when she casts Rest, just like in the intermission. As soon as both ads are dead, you have to right-click both of these web crystal things on the side of the platform to get the web bridge to spawn so everyone can move up to the next platform and kill some more ads. The tanks have to get aggro on the spider ads that spawn on the bridge and bring them up to the big ad that's waiting on the platform, while everyone else goes up and nukes the devoted worshipper ad that has a big shield and is slowly casting Cosmic Apocalypse. You have to kill this ad before the cast finishes or else you're dead. While you're fighting the worshipper, it puts a dot debuff Gloom Touch on a couple players which the healers should dispel, but on Heroic this debuff explodes on the raid for a ton of damage when it's removed, so the healers need to stagger dispelling each one to be able to heal up between the explosions, which is why you assign the dispel order ahead of time. And then you just finish off the rest of the ads on the platform and then click the web crystal to spawn yet another bridge to go and kill the final ads of the phase. You've got the same spiders and the same Void Speaker ad from the beginning, and once you've killed the Void Speaker, use its knockback to get to the final platform with the boss and start phase 3. After a long cast, the boss jumps onto the north side of the platform and then casts the tank mechanic combo. When she casts Infest, a lot needs to happen at once. The tank needs to use a defensive cooldown beforehand to survive the cast, and then start running this way away from the boss with the big circle around them, which explodes after a couple seconds and spawns a bunch of little spider ads that try to run to the boss. Everyone needs to AoE these spiders quickly and use stuns and slows and knockbacks and all that to keep them away from the boss, or else they explode and you're dead. The off tank needs to taunt right after the Infest cast and also use the defensive cooldown to survive the follow-up cast, Gorge. And then the original tank needs to taunt the boss back because Gorge leaves a big physical damage taken increase on its target for a while. When a couple random players get these big web swirly things on them, called Royal Condemnation, they need to move in front of the boss away from the rest of the raid because they explode on the raid after a few seconds, doing less damage to people that are farther away. On Heroic, they also spawn these Royal Shackle ads that slowly pull everyone towards them, so everyone has to nuke these down without getting too close to them. When the boss casts Abyssal Infusion and puts these circles on a couple players, they need to quickly move away from each other, one person on the outside edge of the room and one on the inside edge, because these circles do damage to anyone inside of them and drop a portal on the ground after a couple seconds. And on Heroic, you also have to dodge these orbs that shoot out from the portals when they spawn. Then when the boss casts Frothing Gluttony, she teleports to the middle of the room and spawns a big ring around the outside of the room that shrinks down toward her. And everyone has to go through the portal at the inner edge of the ring once the ring has gone past the portal on the outer edge in order to teleport through the ring, or else you're dead. On Heroic, everyone also has to spread out right after going through the portal because you get these little circles around you that explode after a couple seconds. When the boss casts Queen Summons, 3 of these Acolyte ads spawn on the inner side of the platform, and everyone needs to quickly kill these ads and interrupt their null detonation cast once their shield is broken, because if the ads are still alive by the time the boss casts Frothing Gluttony, you're dead. On Heroic, you also need 3 people to walk onto the essence that each Acolyte drops on the ground in order to pick it up, because if the ring from Frothing Gluttony touches one, you're dead. The dropped essence does a ton of dot damage to whoever picks it up, so they'll definitely need extra healing, but going through the portal removes the essence from the fight, so they won't have it forever. You do, however, have to have 3 different players pick the essence up the next go around. We assigned all of the bomb poppers in phase 1 to be in charge of the essences if you want to go that route, but tanks are also a really good option to pick up a couple of them. And that's pretty much it. Thanks to TSM for giving everyone 15% off, and big thank you to our supporters on Patreon. We've got a ton of Patreon exclusive content coming out this tier, including extended heroic guides, mythic guides, and more. If you're interested in that, check out the links below. Peace.